"Step out of the car," yelled a police officer as Camilla was driving by. The blue and white squad car idled behind Camilla at the light, its reflection flickering across the surface of the silver BMW like a warning. Officer Calhoun tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes narrowed through his aviator sunglasses. His gaze moved from the back of the car to the driver's side window, where a poised black woman in a navy blazer waited calmly for the light to turn green. He leaned sideways, nudged his partner, and spoke just loud enough for the dashcam to miss. "That can't be her car." Across the intersection, traffic moved forward. Brake lights faded into distant taillights as the BMW remained parked at the curb, now under flashing red and blue lights. A voice inside the police cruiser's radio crackled to life as Officer Calhoun ran the plates, clean, registered to a Camilla Truss. But he didn't back off. He stepped out, approached the car slowly as if danger lurked beyond the tinted glass. He tapped the window with his flashlight, the click deliberate. She rolled it down, her demeanor unbothered. Calm, not defiant. That seemed to infuriate him more. "Step out for me." She blinked, her breath slow and even. Camilla exhaled and slowly opened the door. Passers-by on the sidewalk took notice, a woman in a suit, standing next to a luxury car, being questioned by cops. Flashlights swept inside her vehicle, even though there was no call for it. She offered her license before being asked, and when Officer Calhoun saw the photo, his jaw set. The name on her ID matched the registration. Everything slowed then, like the moment before a storm. His questions came without context. How she could afford the car, what she was doing in this part of town, if she knew someone who owned the vehicle, as though the documentation she handed him was borrowed or scripted, as though her very presence in that space needed to be justified. There was no mistake here. Camilla Truss was used to silence that carried accusations, used to smiles that hid offense, and questions that had nothing to do with getting answers. This wasn't new. Not for her. Downtown Atlanta pulsed around them, coffees in hand, briefcases swung past shoulders, music bleeding from nearby storefronts. The lunchtime crowd paid little attention at first. A routine stop, they assumed. Some paused to glance, but traffic and time carried them forward. Camilla kept her voice smooth, her posture straight. There was a particular armor she had learned to wear years ago. It was tailored, pressed, and lined with restraint. It didn't flinch when challenged or raise in pitch when insulted. But inside, something always cracked a little. No matter how many times it happened, it always hurt more than she let on. She glanced subtly toward her purse on the passenger seat. Not yet, she told herself. Calhoun didn't read her license number aloud. He didn't mention the law he thought she'd broken. Instead, he asked her to turn off the engine and step further from the car. She complied, every motion precise, rehearsed, almost theatrical in its discipline. A mother shepherding her 2 children slowed near the crosswalk, her eyes fixed on the scene. An older man across the street reached instinctively for his phone and began recording. The air changed, subtle but electric. The quiet injustice of the moment had just taken its first breath. Camilla stood with the wind brushing the collar of her blazer, her heels softly tapping the pavement. She glanced briefly at the squad car's mounted dashcam, doubting it even worked. Something wasn't right. The growing crowd began to sense it. Calhoun asked if she had a history with law enforcement. He phrased it as if reciting a truth already known. Camilla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked near him, not at him. Past him, perhaps, like she was weighing time itself. 1 block away, the courthouse where she worked stood tall, modern, glass-faced, a symbol of order and structure. There, she was addressed as Your Honor. But here on the sidewalk, she was seen as someone else. The unfairness didn't shock her anymore. But sometimes, in rare moments like this, it felt large enough to swallow a lifetime of restraint. The officer's hand hovered near his belt. She recognized the body language instantly, justified in his own mind, already writing the incident report he thought would protect him. Camilla looked up at the gray Georgia sky. The light was shifting behind the clouds. Across the street, more people were slowing, noticing. Conversations were low now, eyebrows raised. She imagined reading about herself in a headline, not as a leader or jurist, but as a mistaken identity, a footnote in a scandal. Not today, she thought, but still she waited. For every time her professionalism was mistaken for arrogance. For every time she sat at legal conferences only to be asked if she was one of the court reporters. For every time she walked into her own courtroom only to be mistaken for the defendant's family. Still, her throat caught a little when the senior officer on the team, an older white man with gray curls and faded eyes, made a quiet comment to Calhoun. She didn't hear the full sentence, but she caught 3 words: uppity, dangerous, and attitude. She felt the words like stones. The younger officer broke away from the huddle and walked toward her slowly. He didn't speak very loud when he asked her to unlock her passenger door. For investigation, he said. Camilla raised one eyebrow, but did what they asked. One of them leaned in and began looking through her belongings. Carefully, she watched. Wallet, phone, a sealed manila folder beside an umbrella. Then, her leather-bound planner with stamped initials, CT, a bronze pen neatly clipped beside. Everyone in the small crowd forming on the sidewalk could see what was happening now. They didn't know her name, but they knew this wasn't right. A man in a suit who had stopped nearby frowned as another woman whispered, "Is she a lawyer or something?" Someone else pulled out a phone and began recording just as the officer iced her with another look and stepped away from the car without finding anything. Still, they didn't stop. Camilla wasn't someone who cried easily, but there was a sting deep in her chest when she saw a teenage girl across the street watching her with wide eyes. That hurt the most, being seen like this by someone young. Someone who deserved better examples of how black women were treated in broad daylight. She wanted to walk over and tell the girl the truth. You will carry this too, even when you play by all the rules. Even when you work 10 times harder. Even when you smile small and answer softly. It still won't be enough for some people. But she stood still. The senior officer approached her again, this time walking slower, more cautiously. He glanced again at the license. Then at her car, then back to her, as if the pieces weren't fitting together. You live around here? He finally muttered. Camilla gave no clear response. She didn't owe him one. Another officer checked his radio. Calhoun was still unsatisfied, pacing near the driver's side door and muttering to himself. He asked again why she had not immediately presented herself as someone of importance, as if her dignity was conditional on a title they respected. As if by not proving herself right away, she had brought all this on herself. That question stayed with her. Why hadn't she said who she was from the beginning? Because, she thought, she shouldn't have to. Titles didn't matter when skin color already decided the story. Because even if she said she was a judge, they wouldn't have believed it. Not until they saw proof. Not until she removed the very dignity they were trying to step on and held it up like armor. But Camilla had always chosen timing carefully. Truth spoken too early could be dismissed or spun. But truth, delivered in silence that follows an avalanche of wrong, is undeniable, and it shames the ones who tried to bury it. So still she waited. The air grew heavier. Street horns behind the police blockade honked in frustration. More bystanders took out phones. A mother recording on her phone asked to see identification from the officers. She said something about the mayor. That word spread. Eyes shifted, alert. Camilla was still and tall, like a stone in the river. Surrounded, yet unmoved. Somewhere within her purse, her court-issued badge sat beside her pen. Her judicial credentials, sealed with the state emblem, bore her full name, the Honorable Camilla Truss. But she kept her hands down. Her patience was her protest. Her silence was the most powerful thing in the street. Not because she said nothing, but because she refused to act the way they expected, fearful, angry, shaky. She wasn't small. She wouldn't be made small. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled them. They didn't realize it yet, but the power in this scene was about to change hands. People began stopping in clusters now, drawn by something deeper than flashing lights or curiosity. The situation had grown beyond a traffic stop. This wasn't just a checkpoint for law and order anymore. It was a mirror held quietly in the middle of the city, asking everyone who passed, "What do you see here?" The answer came in glances, in questions whispered behind cupped hands, in the slow reach for smartphones. A woman in hospital scrubs paused halfway across the crosswalk, eyebrows furrowing as she looked from the calm woman standing beside the sleek BMW to the 3 police officers crowded around her. She didn't even need to know what started it. Her gut told her enough. A few yards away, a young man leaned against a parking meter, camera already rolling. His voice was quiet as he narrated into his phone. "This is happening right in front of the courthouse. It's broad daylight." She hasn't raised her voice once. The tension had taken root in the air like a storm stalling over the city. It wasn't loud yet, not chaos, not confrontation, but it was undeniable. A slow current of unease passing through the growing circle of watchers. Camilla Truss remained where she was, standing with regal calm, giving nothing away except control. The weight of judgment still pressed hard against her, slithering from every glance the officers threw her way. They looked impatient now, annoyed, as though this moment, her unwillingness to break, to shout, to resist, was an inconvenience they didn't know how to process. To them, a scene like this was only meant to go 2 ways, submission or explosion. Camilla gave them neither, and that confused them. Hints of doubt now flickered behind their eyes. Not enough to reverse course, but enough for uncertainty to take hold. They had done the usual dance, pulled the driver over, asked the layered questions, demanded compliance in vague terms, lifted suspicion from thin air and wore it like armor. But she had stayed too solid, too focused, too professional. That scared them more than someone yelling ever could. The crowd, on the other hand, began to lean in closer, not physically yet, but emotionally. Their hearts stepped toward her. More people began recording. Whispered conversations circled like vines. "She looks like a lawyer." "No, a judge." "She hasn't even moved aggressively." "So, why the backup?" A college-aged girl in a hoodie quietly asked no one in particular, "Why is it always like this?" What did she even do? A little boy on a scooter tugged at his mother's coat and asked in a voice too innocent to ignore, "Mama, why are the police yelling at that lady?" The mother knelt to whisper a reply, her face drawn with the pain of trying to explain to a child something no child should ever have to understand. Camilla met that mother's eyes. Just for a second, they held each other in quiet acknowledgement, not as strangers, but as 2 black women who understood exactly what it meant to witness each other in this moment. The officer who had been rifling through her glove compartment returned to the others, empty-handed and frustrated. One of them muttered something under his breath. She didn't need to hear it to know it carried resentment, about her car, her clothes, her calm, her refusal to shrink. What was it about her silence that felt so loud to them? Because it was power, the quiet kind, the kind they hadn't prepared for. And, in her stillness, they heard everything she didn't say. The courts she sat on, the orders she had delivered, the systems she'd held accountable. She wasn't just a woman in a nice car. She was someone who could look at injustice and name it for what it was. But still the officers didn't see who Camilla truly was, not yet. She hadn't revealed it, hadn't opened her purse, hadn't touched the ID badge resting between her fingers. Not because she was afraid, but because this moment wasn't about her credentials. It was about the problem itself. Recognition without revelation. Truth without explanation. It was what so many people of color dream of, being seen as worthy not because of who they worked for or how much they make, but because they are human. But the crowd, unconsciously, was getting closer to the truth. Whispers of recognition spread like embers on dry grass. Distrust turned into belief. Suspicion turned into support. This was no ordinary person, they knew now. She radiated something more. A local journalist happened to be walking by on her lunch break and took notice. She stood still for just 20 seconds before pulling out her press badge and beginning to record. She didn't need the full backstory. The visual was enough, a black woman in a blazer, surrounded by 3 officers, while people quietly watched in disbelief. The air itself seemed to lean in. The wind carried murmurs of the past, echoes of Sanderbland, of mistrust and buried names. Generations of fear danced just beneath the surface of this moment. But Camilla stood planted, refusing to give it breath. A middle-aged man near the edge of the crowd, dressed in business casual, asked to see her license. Not to question her, but to help, to try and understand her name. She met his eyes but said nothing. Not yet. Her stillness was her answer. And still she waited, not for their disbelief to vanish, but for the weight of their wrongness to become impossible to ignore. Every extra second that passed, the crowd leaned further into her side. The officers became more flustered. The story they were trying to shape, that of suspicion and compliance, was crumbling right there on the sidewalk in front of everyone's lens. Soon, someone in the crowd recognized her. It began with a sharp inhale from the journalist. "Oh my God," she whispered to no one before her tone shifted into a different kind of recording. Facts now, not curiosity. She zoomed in on Camilla's face. The expression, the posture, the truth of the story etched in real time. And yet still, Camilla said nothing. She did not need to justify the car she drove, the blazer she wore, the lipstick she applied that morning with the confidence of someone who had scheduled a board meeting. The officers didn't know, but they were walking toward their own undoing. Because this crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were remembering, recording, seeding a memory the internet would soon carry across the country. And somewhere, beneath the roar of injustice, the power had begun to shift. Quietly, irrevocably, like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The wind shifted, not just in weather, but in atmosphere. Somewhere in the energy of that crowded sidewalk, that circling suspicion, a fault line had cracked open, and no one quite knew where to look. Officer Calhoun was pacing now, mask slipping. He barked instructions to his partner, voice tight, sharp with the frustration of trying to force control over a situation already slipping through his fingers. He had expected cooperation that folded, not silence that stood like granite. What he got instead was a woman who moved like she'd seen men like him 1,000 times before and had judged them all. Camilla Truss watched him like a professor watching a student unravel during an oral exam. Except this wasn't theory. This was her life, her body, her car, her name, all placed under suspicion because she didn't match the story he'd written in his head. He had written suspicious. She wore successful. He had expected fear. She returned him indifference. Not from arrogance, from certainty, the kind you had to earn. Still, they circled. The officers, the accusations, the looks. Beneath her blazer, her heart thudded slow and steady, carrying memories of worse. But this time was different. Not because the harassment was new, it wasn't, but because those watching truly saw it. Not just with their eyes, but with something deeper. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to anger, from doubt to belief, from bystander to witness. Camilla's silence wasn't passive. It was chess, the slow power kind of silence, the kind only someone who had already seen the whole board could hold. Things weren't tense anymore. They were turning. One of the officers stepped away momentarily to speak into his shoulder radio. Another pulled out a clipboard and pretended to be noting something. But Calhoun remained at the center, still clinging to the assumption that if he barked enough orders wrapped in clipped authority, the pieces would fall back into place. But the crowd wasn't disappearing, and Camilla wasn't breaking. Then she spoke, not with fire, but with precision. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to make him pause, and said one name. A name he recognized. A name from internal memos he thought no one read. The name of an assistant district attorney he'd once questioned harshly in court, a man with connections and a long memory, someone Camilla had once served alongside on a panel debate about restorative justice. She said it softly without emphasis, like a note being passed at the back of a classroom. Officer Calhoun showed the first flicker of doubt. She followed it with another name, this time a member of the city ethics board. Then another, the head of internal affairs. One by one, names that had no place on the lips of a suspect began entering the conversation. Camilla didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. This wasn't a performance for the crowd. This was a reminder for him. That power does not always wear a badge. That dignity, when held, tightly, has its own kind of sharpness. Then she did something small, almost forgettable. She reached into her purse. Slow, visible, meticulous. The movement was peaceful, measured, yet every officer flinched just slightly, hands reacting to muscle memory. The memory of fear pushed by years of rhetoric and poor training. They didn't see a hand. They saw a headline. But Camilla didn't pause. She kept reaching. And from her purse, she pulled a slim leather wallet. She opened it with one hand. The gold-embossed seal caught the sun before anything else did. Then the words, State of Georgia, Judicial Identification. Whatever noise the street had held, car horns, phone beeps, snatches of distant conversation, fell quiet backstage to the reveal unfolding front and center. The badge reflected more than sunlight. It reflected the truth. Camilla Truss, Superior Court Judge. The full weight of her identity slid, like a key, into the lock of every assumption built that day. Faces changed. Officer Calhoun's breath caught, for a second too long. He blinked like someone waking up in a room they forgot they walked into. Camilla's ID card didn't just tell them who she was. It told them what they'd become in this moment. They hadn't just profiled a woman in a car. They'd profiled a public servant, a community leader, a sitting judge who that very morning had reviewed a memorandum on ethics in law enforcement. One who had signed papers that week impacting policing standards across multiple districts. One who, in that single small gesture, had burned the fragile script Officer Calhoun had been writing all afternoon. There was a shift in posture, the kind people try to hide but never fully can. The arrogant lean dissolved. The quick, sharp authority dulled. One of the younger officers stepped slightly back, hewing the regret they weren't prepared to wear so publicly. The crowd erupted not in jeers, but in murmured rage-turned relief. People gasped quietly. Several clapped once, unsure what else to do. Notifications pinged from smartphones. That woman's a judge. They just profiled a judge. The young man with the camera shook his head, whispering, he just cost himself everything. And still Camilla stood the same. Same heels. Same ballpoint pen clipped in her jacket. Same quiet breath. But the story had changed. Now, she wasn't just a black woman beside a luxury car. She was a black jurist disrespected on the very pavement carved into her jurisdiction. And she still hadn't raised her voice. Officer Calhoun tried, too late to recover. Words stumbled out, but they landed like broken steps. Camilla didn't respond to them. Instead, she handed over her card calmly, all protocol intact, but laced with something sharp beneath, the knowing. The unspoken understanding that this moment would follow him like a shadow. To his supervisor, to his review board, maybe to every precinct he ever applied to again. Because while they had called for backup out of fear, now they needed it out of damage control. And though Calhoun still wore the badge, the power in the street had clearly moved on. It stood taller, breathed freer, and had just pulled out a judge's ID. In just 1 second, one moment of undeniable truth, the roles had reversed. The people watching saw it. The officers felt it. And Camilla already knew. The moment the badge touched daylight, everything changed. Calhoun stepped back, not out of respect but instinct, retreating from the realization that he had just lit a match inside a house drenched in gasoline. The wind carried whispers now, charged not with pity but outrage. The scene no longer looked like a traffic stop. It looked like a reckoning. The camera phone lights glimmered like stars across the street. Everyone had their lenses fixed on her now. Not because she was in distress, but because she had just rewritten the entire chapter in a single, silent move. Judge Camilla Truss, etched in gold and backed by the state of Georgia. It should have ended there. But humiliation has a strange way of clinging to bruised egos. Calhoun tried to salvage authority, stammering, gesturing at paperwork and procedures, but the words felt too small now. They rolled from his tongue like pebbles, meaningless against the stone wall of what had just been revealed. Camilla didn't respond. She didn't correct him or demand an apology. She simply watched. That was often enough in her line of work. Let people sit in the weight of what they had done, and let them find their own silence. The other officers took subtle steps back, not away from the car, but from responsibility. All the questions they had asked her now flickered in cruel hindsight. Could she afford the car? Was her ID real? Was she where she was supposed to be? Each one, now exposed like a bone break under X-ray, raw, ugly, avoidable. They hadn't stopped a vehicle to uphold the law. They had chosen a face, not a license plate. In the crowd, a man with a podcast mic was already live streaming. This is what people mean when they say it doesn't matter who you are. They saw a black woman in a nice car and told themselves a story. But the truth broke that story apart. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just gave them a badge, and now we're looking at the beginning of the end for Officer Calhoun. The irony was cruel and sharp. All the signs had been there. Her blazer, tailored and classic. Her calm, the kind that comes from years of authority. Even her car keys, tagged with a courthouse parking fob. But they'd looked straight through all of it. Because belief has bias, and bias had decided this wasn't her car, wasn't her success, wasn't her street. Until the badge said otherwise. But it wasn't just the physical ID that changed things. It was the full picture finally revealed. Online, clips raced across social media like wildfire. The angles, the murmurs, the moment she unzipped her purse and held the badge up with quiet finality. Millions watched as the scene rewrote itself, second by second. News tickers picked it up. Superior Court judge misidentified in Atlanta traffic stop. But Camilla wasn't interested in headlines. Not then. Not yet. Her eyes scanned the officers one more time, not with contempt but comprehension. She knew what was coming. Somewhere in a nearby building, a supervisor was already pulling footage, checking timestamps. Internal Affairs would soon be clawing through every use of force report Calhoun had ever submitted. Civil rights lawyers would now walk into courtrooms with this footage as proof that professionalism and polish couldn't protect black bodies from assumption. And that was the twist that sat deepest in Camilla's chest. Because if this could happen to her, a judge, a guardian of the law, how many people had been dismissed, detained, or destroyed because their power wasn't visible, because their position couldn't be pulled from a purse? How many black men and women had been dragged from cars, cuffed on sidewalks, interrogated in banks, followed through hotels, because someone mistook presence for threat? This incident wasn't shocking because it happened. It was shocking because she had the badge to survive it. Calhoun's face had changed completely now, that rigid jaw slowly giving way to something closer to penitence, although he still hadn't spoken it aloud. He didn't apologize, not yet, but his stance said what his mouth couldn't. This was going to follow him. In whisper networks, in magistrate meetings, in public forums. And he wasn't imagining it. Calls started pouring into the precinct minutes after the video spread. A city council member texted the deputy chief. Protests were already being planned in group chats. But amid all of that, Camilla remained still. The truth had been spoken. There was no need to repeat it. A woman from the crowd approached, someone unfamiliar but clearly moved, and simply said thank you. Not loudly, not dramatically, just genuinely. Thank you for standing tall. Thank you for not reacting the way they expected. Thank you for reminding us what power looks like even when it's surrounded. Another person placed a hand on Camilla's shoulder and whispered, "We needed this." Not the humiliation, not the injustice, the reveal, the mirror turned upward, the visible truth that too often arrives too late. Camilla finally glanced at the officers again, her badge still in hand. And in that glance was the same quiet that carried courtrooms, the ability to remind someone that justice wasn't just a verdict. Sometimes it was a lesson playing out in real time. Sometimes it was the moment before public accountability arrived with sirens of its own. Officer Calhoun returned her license, hands shaking slightly despite trying to appear firm. Still, his badge suddenly looked smaller, less protective, more exposed. And without saying a word, Camilla walked back to her car. Not marched, walked. She didn't have to reclaim her dignity. It had never left her. She opened her car door with the same ease she'd used that morning when she left home to meet with local leaders about police reform legislation. She had dressed for professionalism. But life had dressed her for battle, and she had won with a whisper. The driver's side door clicked shut, the ignition hummed to life. But she didn't pull away, just yet. Through the window, she looked at the young girl still standing with her mother on the other side of the street. Their eyes met again, and this time Camilla smiled. Not a smile of victory, a smile of recognition. You saw it too. A pause, then the BMW pulled away. Quiet, controlled, complete. Behind her, the sidewalk remained full. The phone still filmed. The officers didn't move, but their story? That had already left with her. The fallout began before Camilla reached the next red light. Her phone, sitting in the passenger seat beside her briefcase and the now historic badge holder, began to vibrate. Then again, then continuously. Text after text, call after call, screens lighting up with names from City Hall, legal circles, old classmates, former colleagues, reporters. Not just friends concerned for her well-being, but figures of influence moved by the weight of what happened. Camilla didn't rush to answer. She kept driving. Slow, measured, the same pace she had held throughout every second that led to this. The scene she had left behind was no longer just an inconvenience on a busy street. It had become a symbol, a wound ripped open in broad daylight, and thanks to the crowd and the unmistakable impact of one ID badge held out in steady defiance, millions now had their eyes on it. The footage spread with speed usually reserved for scandal or death. But this was different. This was survival, in a way that spoke into the bones of entire communities. It was raw-proof relief. See, even a judge isn't safe. But also, see what happens when you recognize your own worth and refuse to lower your gaze? Camilla didn't speak to the media that first day. She didn't have to. The world was already speaking for her. Headlines sprawled across major outlets within hours. Judge racially profiled during traffic stop just steps from her own courtroom. Atlanta police under fire after high-profile misidentification goes viral. The face of justice, how Camilla Truss held her power, and a badge to expose police bias. In police headquarters across the city's downtown precinct, silence replaced the usual morning noise. Officer Calhoun, once so sure of his assumptions, sat behind a closed door in a meeting with Internal Affairs. The body camera footage, usually hidden from public scrutiny, had already been leaked alongside cell phone videos from more than 6 angles. Not one showed Camilla acting aggressively. Not one revealed a crime. Not a broken taillight. Not a missed turn signal. Just a woman pulled over, questioned, surrounded, and treated as other. A superior walked into the room where Calhoun sat and closed the door behind him, slowly, as if confirming something irreversible. The day before, it had been paperwork and patrols. Today, it was lawyers and apologies. Because the institution was being watched now, across social platforms, thousands posted under hashtags like #SheIsTheJudge and #SameStreetSameJustice. Black women everywhere shared photos of themselves in offices, in courtrooms, in classrooms, dressed like Camilla, faces stoic, eyes that had seen too much, shoulders squared for unfair battles. "This is how we have to stand," one caption read, "even when they try to knock us down." Lawyers who had worked with Camilla on past reforms reached out. Civil rights groups offered statements. But it wasn't just supporters who reached out. The chief of police called her office before dusk. Declined. The mayor's office sent flowers. Returned. Because apologies after exposure weren't the same as accountability. And Camilla wasn't interested in appearances. Not now. Not until the truth had teeth. The department placed all 3 responding officers on immediate leave pending a departmental review. All appearances for Officer Calhoun were suspended. His supervisor was reassigned to administrative duty. But these weren't acts of justice. They were scraps of consequence thrown into the tide of public anger, hoping the flood wouldn't rise further. It did. By morning, protests formed outside precincts. Not violent, but deliberate. Silent marches. Young girls wearing navy blazers. Little boys in toy judge robes holding cardboard signs. Am I enough yet? And all across the city, people asked the same question. If Camilla didn't have her badge, what would have happened? Some already knew the answer too well. Camilla agreed to give a statement the following week. Not in front of a swarm of microphones, but before a full city council, with both police leaders and judicial colleagues present. She stood behind a wooden podium carved with the emblem of her state, not just as a judge, but as a woman who had felt the quiet violence of injustice and held her ground until it broke itself. She didn't read from notes. She began her address not with what had been done to her, but with what had nearly happened to those officers the moment they assumed she didn't belong, the way they had nearly dismissed a woman whose life was built on truth and fairness, the way they had almost destroyed everything about her that they were sworn to protect. Then she shifted the weight back. Camilla's focus wasn't on her pain, it was on responsibility. On the system that lets training overlap with prejudice, where gut feeling is too often just coded fear. Where the law gives second chances to uniforms, but not to skin color. Her voice, steady and sonorous, moved across the room with the gravity of a closing gavel. She didn't ask for revenge. She didn't name call or shame. She asked for restructuring, re-education, for measurable change, not press releases. The city council passed a motion hours later to launch an independent investigation into sworn officer conduct across 3 precincts. A task force on racial bias was formed and placed under Camilla's interim advisory. Within days, a vote was passed to require anti-profiling training at all levels of city policing, including leadership, mandatory, annual, public-facing. The mayor, who had once remained quiet on past controversies, now held a conference pledging real reform, stating everything changed because one woman stood firm. But Camilla didn't want statues, honors, or awards, because beneath every ceremony she carried the deeper truth. She had only survived because she had the privilege of a title behind her voice. That knowledge haunted her. What about the countless others, invisible, unnamed, who hadn't had badges in their purses? Who didn't have cameras? Who didn't get to go home? Camilla carried their pain now too. And so, each change, each new measure sign bore their name, even if the ink only showed hers. Back at the courthouse, her chambers remained elegant and quiet. A shelf behind her held cases she'd ruled on over the years, a few framed degrees, a family photo. A new addition now sat beside them. One of the protest signs, dropped at her office door by a teenage girl with no note. It read in simple marker, "Your silence was louder than sirens." Camilla looked at it often, because she never wanted to forget what it took to prove she deserved to stand where she already belonged. The city did not return to normal. It transformed. The stoplight where it had all begun, just outside the courthouse, dripping with afternoon heat and unspoken assumptions, was no longer just a place where cars paused. It became a landmark of reckoning, of awakening. The kind that stays long after apologies have been made. Camilla Truss wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity, but her name traveled anyway, not because of what she said, but because of what she stood through. The video had lived its own life on screens across the globe, but in her city, it had built something new, pressure for permanence. No one was asking for apologies anymore. They were demanding change. Leadership in the city responded faster than ever before, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. No quiet corner was free from questions now. Inside news stations, boardrooms, universities, police departments, the question echoed everywhere. If a sitting judge can be treated that way, who among us is truly safe? So they began. Mandatory racial bias training was not only implemented across the police force, it was open to city employees. Every public servant who wore a badge, carried a clipboard, issued permits, or sat behind reception desks was now required to attend 3-day equity and accountability sessions led by independent Black and Indigenous educators. No more boxes to tick. This training didn't exist just for optics. It was held with intensity, discomfort, and truth. And standing at the helm of this review board, unpaid but unwavering, was Camilla. She sat across tables from the same men who once questioned the need for such training. She listened more than she spoke, taking notes, nodding when others spoke uncomfortable truths. She didn't seek control, but her perspective anchored the group. She reminded them consistently, this isn't about public image, it's about rehumanizing the spaces we serve in. The city council allocated funding toward long-overdue reform. A new community oversight division was formed, composed of civilians, attorneys, educators, and former public defenders, to review misconduct claims independently. Their word would no longer be symbolic. It had power. Each month, data on stops, detainments, and disciplinary action was made public. Transparent. For the first time, people could see not only how often officers overstepped, but what was being done afterward. Trust couldn't be repaired with words. Camilla had taught them that. Students studied her case in law schools across the country, not just for the violation it exposed, but for how she handled it, her use of silence, her timing, her restraint, and the avalanche of consequence that followed. Professors added her name alongside cases that had shaped public perception before. But Camilla wasn't interested in being that kind of lesson. She only hoped the story reminded others of their own power, even when surrounded, even when doubted. But beneath the policy changes, beneath the press statements and staff removals, something else had happened, something harder to measure. A question had entered the city's bloodstream. What if she hadn't been a judge? And that question wouldn't go away. Even as reforms were rolled out, even as uniforms were retrained and public murals were painted with phrases like dignity is a right, that question kept pulsing in classrooms, churches, barbershops, stoops, living rooms. What if she hadn't had the badge? When Camilla sat back in her courtroom weeks later, she noticed something different. People looked at her not just as a judge, but as a survivor of what they'd always known but the world had finally seen. She felt the weight of that visibility. Young attorneys approached her after hearings, some teary, others embarrassed by how close they'd come to staying silent in their own moments of mistreatment. Her courtroom was no longer just a place of legal ruling. It had become, quietly, a sanctuary of truth. Justice didn't always start with a gavel. Sometimes it began with a stop sign, a sidewalk, and a silence so dignified it couldn't be ignored. Journalists continued to ask where she found the strength that day, how she chose silence instead of rage, posture instead of protest. Every time, Camilla gave the same answer, simple and unsensational. I knew who I was. That was it. She didn't yell, because she didn't have to. The truth was louder. And people had finally begun to listen. Months after the stop, Officer Calhoun's case concluded. He was removed from the force. Not because of a single act, but because the review opened a door to his long pattern. Dozens of quiet complaints swept into dark corners that no one had cared to open until now. He left through a side door. Without cameras or press, the empire of assumption he'd built now caved in by facts. Camilla never mentioned his name publicly, not because she forgave it, but because his name was not the story. The story was this: she existed in a world that didn't expect her to belong. And she stood still anyway. She never asked for this battle, but she had the tools to win it. Not just paper credentials or colleagues on speed dial, but poise, memory, and unshakable worth. The kind they never trained for at the academy. One afternoon, a classroom of middle school students visited her court chambers for a field trip. Among them was the girl she had seen on that day, the one clinging to her mother's arm when the officers surrounded her. The same wide eyes, the same quiet gaze. This time, though, the girl wasn't watching from the sidelines. She wore a navy blue blazer and asked 2 questions in front of the whole class. How did you stay calm when they didn't treat you fair? And after a pause, I's proud now. Can someone like me be a judge too one day? Camilla answered with a smile, the same one she wore when she drove away from that scene months ago. Yes, she said, you already are one on the inside. And as the classroom clapped softly, she knew the system hadn't just changed. It had been cracked open. Not perfectly, but permanently. And from there, the work continued. If you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for seeing this story through, for bearing witness not just to its pain, but to its strength. Discrimination has no place in any corner of this world, but justice does. And stories like Camilla's remind us what grace under pressure looks like, when the world isn't watching, and especially when it is. If you believe dignity should never be up for debate, hit that subscribe button to support stories that matter. Share your thoughts and keep the conversation alive. Because silence can protect, but voices, they ignite change.